What's up, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you hear little birds in the background, I apologize. This time, I promise you, they're not my parrots. It's just nature. It was like 70 degrees where I live today, and all of the animals just immediately assumed it was spring and have been losing their minds. And so I actually had to wait until nighttime to film today because it was just so loud. But unfortunately, some of them they're still here. But today, I'm actually finally covering a case that you guys have been asking me for, and I actually promised you guys I would do like over 2 years ago, and that is the Speed Freak Killers, who I first mentioned in my Michaela Garrett video. There was a pretty large possibility that the Speed Freak Killers were involved in her disappearance and possible murder, and there were even remains and things found connected to the Speed Freak Killers in 2012, and there was DNA testing done to see if maybe some of the remains could belong to Michaela. But this past December, if you guys watched the video, there was a huge update on Michaela Garrett's case, and there is someone that has been arrested, and it's not the Speed Freak Killers. So when I did that video, I remembered I never gave you guys this video, and you guys also reminded me of that in the comments, so here I am to finally deliver to you guys. Now, the two individuals who are known as the Speed Freak Killers have collectively murdered a handful of individuals. However, it is strongly believed, and I'm speaking under 10, it's strongly believed that they could actually have 70 plus victims, making them some of the most prolific serial killers in the United States. And that is why it is so important to cover this case, because majority of their victims are pretty much unknown. So I know you guys are constantly telling me you browse through NamUs and you look through different missing persons cases and you try to connect them to serial killers, or, there's just a lot of you guys that put a lot of work into trying to connect some dots. And I figured, authorities are definitely working on this, but exposure and you guys putting in some helping hands is absolutely beneficial as well. But before I get into the details of this case, I also need to say thank you to Audible for sponsoring today's video and for quite literally always supporting my channel. For those of you that don't know, Audible is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment. They have everything literally from audiobooks to meditation, like guided meditation, guided workouts. There's comedy, there's sleep tracks, and it's so convenient to use Audible because you can use it on any device, anytime, anywhere. I personally love to listen to audiobooks while I'm in the car or I'm at the gym, or even if I'm just doing chores. I am a huge multitasker and I hate wasted time. So if I'm doing something so mundane as like the dishes or folding laundry, it makes me feel a little bit better when I'm listening to an audiobook at the same time and broadening my horizons. I'm currently listening to an audiobook that I like quite literally could scream. I have never been so excited to share an audiobook with you guys. It is called The Mind of a Murderer, and it was released just this past January by a forensic psychologist named Dr. Richard Taylor. We all know majority of the audiobooks that I listen to are related to forensic psychology, but I've yet to find one that's totally dedicated to it, and this is the one. Dr. Richard Taylor has been in the field for over 26 years, and he speaks about a ton of different high-profile cases, and you can get a really good look into why these killers do what they do and, what in their past may have triggered it. He even goes into, which is honestly something I've been very interested in, and John Lorden and I actually had a whole podcast kind of on this, but what the average person just could be pushed to do because of circumstances. So it's very wild. I highly recommend it, and it's been very insightful, especially while I've been looking into the Speed Freak Killers, because they seem to only kill for the thrill of it. Audible also gives their members more than ever right now with their brand new Plus catalog, which contains thousands and thousands of select audiobooks, Audible originals. There's more of the guided meditation, more of the guided workouts, and it's all just included in your membership, so it comes at no extra cost for you. Right now, you can get the first 6 months for only $9.95, which is less than their typical membership price. This allows you one title from the premium selection, and then all of the content you could ever dream of on the Plus catalog. If you want to get your first 6 months for only $9.95, all you have to do is go to www.audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500-500. Thank you again to Audible for sponsoring today's video, and now what you've all been waiting for. So the speed freak killers consist of two individuals, like I said, Wesley Shermantine and Lauren Herzog. And they basically got their name because they went on a meth-fueled killing spree that lasted for 15 plus years. And we're not entirely sure, from my understanding, exactly how long they did this. It was believed that they maybe started at the age of 18 to 19, but authorities have theorized they could have been doing this for much longer, which is very terrifying. But from what I've seen, between 82 and 84 is when this likely began, and it continued on until they were caught in 1999. Wesley and Lauren grew up childhood friends, pretty much knew each other from birth on. They both lived on the exact same street in a very small town called Linden, California. I think the town has about 1,000 people in it, and it was your typical small town vibe of everyone knows everyone, and everyone definitely knew Wesley and Lauren. At a very young age, the boys were just your average little boys. They spent a lot of time outside. Wesley's dad was very active with both of them and would take them out hunting and fishing. They were in San Joaquin County, and there's just a lot of farmland and wooded areas and small bits of mountains near there. So they explored pretty much all of that. And they spent all of their time exploring this area as children, so they knew all of San Joaquin County like the back of their hand. Now, once they got into high school, they spent their free time a little bit different. At this point, they would still roam the woods and the streams and the different mine shafts that are in San Joaquin. But instead of just for fun and pretend, this time they were going to these areas to drink and do drugs. That's a lot of what they did in high school. They would drink a lot, did drugs, and if they weren't doing that, they were typically bullying people. They were known as being big bullies all throughout high school. And from my understanding, Lauren seemed just like a little bit more calm than Wesley was. Wesley seemed to be the ringleader according to a lot of different people, but it definitely wasn't a good situation, and Wesley proved that time and time again. There were a handful of times when Wesley was in high school where he was accused of sexual assault, and I have yet to see that any charges ever came against him. But there were definitely a lot of people that were accusing him. And once they both got out of high school, this kind of behavior continued and worsened. Both Wesley and Lauren decided immediately after high school to move in together, and they got an apartment at nearby Stockton, California. And this time they fell into harder drugs very quickly. They started really experimenting a lot with meth, again, which ended up fueling their killing sprees. And to add to that, Wesley kind of moved on from sexually assaulting people and was for the first time ever investigated in a disappearance of a young girl. So there was a 16-year-old girl named Chevelle. She was referred to as Chevy Wheeler, and she attended the same high school as Wesley and Lauren. Obviously, Wesley and Lauren were much older than her at this point, but Wesley was the last person to be seen with Chevy Wheeler. And when she went missing, obviously that made him the first person that they went to. Now, unfortunately, authorities were not able to prove anything or connect any dots. It seemed like one of those cases where everyone just kind of knew something happened and Wesley was involved, but if they couldn't prove it, there was nothing they could do until almost a decade later in 1998, when Wesley and Lauren were caught because of the disappearance of another woman in Linden, Cindy Vanderheiden. And this is kind of their downfalling, and I don't believe authorities really knew what they were about to uncover. So Cindy was from Clements, California, which is still in San Joaquin County, and she was 25 years old, and at the time of 1998, she was living with her parents. She had just gone through a pretty rough patch in life and needed just a little bit of assistance to get back up on her feet. She was working a part-time job that eventually led to a full-time job, and she was able to put enough money aside to buy her own car, and she was so excited about it and was so excited about where her job was heading. So basically her whole life was turning around, and then she fell victim to Wesley and Lauren. On the day of November 14th, 1998, Cindy was spending the day with her mom. They decided to go shopping for a little while. They had lunch. And then later on that night, she wanted to head to a place called Linden Inn. And Linden Inn was actually a bar that was owned and operated by her father. He owned and operated quite a few bars in the area. There was one in Clements, there was one in Linden, and the one in Linden in particular had karaoke that night, and Cindy really wanted to go sing karaoke. So she spoke to both of her parents, tried to convince them to go with her, but they said they were tired, they didn't want to go. So she decided to change plans and call up a friend, and they were just going to go have a night out on the town and end up at Linden Inn for karaoke and a good time. So that night, Cindy's friend met her at her dad's other bar in Clements, the town that they were living in, and they had a few drinks there, and then they decided to leave Cindy's car at the bar in Clements and drive in her friend's car to Linden Inn. Now, when they got there, they were having a good time, and it just so happened that Lauren and Wesley were there. And Cindy was familiar with both of them. So it's not like they were total strangers to her in the slightest. Lauren was actually very close to Cindy's older sister. They had been good friends, so Lauren was familiar with Cindy, and I mean, it was to the point where they were on like a nickname basis. She called him Slim, and she was on good terms with him, but she also knew Wesley the same way everybody did, which was he was trouble. He was dangerous because she knew of all the sexual assault accusations. She knew about the fact that he was investigated by authorities, and it wasn't just, oh, it's possible he did this. When it comes to Chevy Wheeler's disappearance, he was the last one with her, and he was actually still at this point the main person of interest, potential suspect in the case. But because she knew Lauren, and Lauren was always very protective of her, he was always protective of her sister, she figured she was in safe hands. Plus, she was at her dad's bar, so she kind of felt like she was in the safety bubble. That entire night, they spent some time together. They were all playing pool, obviously karaoke. They were having drinks. At around 2 a.m., Cindy decided it was time for them to head back. She was tired. She had work early the next day. So her and her friend headed out, just the two of them. And they drove back to Clements, where Cindy got in her own car. And then Cindy's friend even followed her all the way home until she pulled into her driveway to make sure she was safe. But she didn't wait to see Cindy go inside. The next morning, Cindy's mom and dad woke up, and her mom remembered looking in her room and seeing that her bed was made and thought, that was very impressive of her because she made it before leaving for work early in the morning after being out at night. But then she started talking to Cindy's father, and they both were like, it's not very normal for us to not, one of us to not see her in the morning. So just to be safe, because she had some, run-ins and issues in the past, they decided to call her work and make sure she was all right. And her work told them that she never showed up that morning. And this was entirely unlike Cindy at this point. She had been working very hard at this job and to keep progressing at it. And she was very proud of the car, and she knew she had car payments to make and was planning to move out soon. This was not like her. So Cindy's father decided to go drive around Clements and the surrounding areas trying to look for her. And by later on that night, her car ended up being found at Glenview Cemetery, and it had all of her belongings in it. It had her purse, her ID, it had her cell phone in it. Everything was in her car. At this point, Cindy was reported missing, and it became a huge community effort. And I could put a lot more detail into this case because the work that her family did and the work that the community did is absolutely astounding. They had an entire call center where they took in tips themselves. There were so many searches. They brought out helicopters and were on horseback. It was a pretty big search for Cindy and a lot of dedicated people trying to bring her home safe. But authorities are also looking into this case, and they are realizing for the second time that Wesley was the last person or one of the last people to be with a woman or a young girl that went missing. So to kind of explain Chevy's disappearance, again, she was only 16 years old. It was, I believe, October of 85, and her mom dropped her off at school. And it was a Friday, and she had plans that weekend, starting later that night, to go to the mountains with Wesley, to his mountain house. And her mom knew about this. Wesley had even called that day, called Chevy's mom to confirm that Chevy would still be there. But what happened is Chevy decided to play hooky. She got to school, told her friends she was going to leave early to go to the mountains with Wesley, and she was never seen again. And authorities somehow couldn't figure out how this 18-year-old, or he might have been 19 at the time, managed to leave with a young girl and then not come back with her and left no trace of anything happening. I don't know what explanation he used. I have no clue how that wasn't solved at all. So at this point, authorities obviously are thinking this is very suspicious. So they decide to hit the ground and running in terms of searches. Now, as I said, everyone knew Wesley and Lauren. They were like the town troublemakers locally, and they had been pretty much their whole life. So everyone knew about their families. Everyone knew that they spent a lot of time out in the backwood areas of San Joaquin County. So authorities were very smart, and they actually figured out all of Lauren and Wesley's favorite places to go, all of the rivers that they went to, their favorite hunting locations, the trails that they would go on, and they searched all these silently without Lauren or Wesley knowing, to see if there was a body that had been disposed of, to see if they could find Cindy. This is how positive they were that these men were involved. But after searching and searching and searching, unfortunately, they weren't able to find anything. So they decided it was time to just bring Lauren and Wesley in and question them both, hoping that they would rat each other out or they could get some sort of answers. But boy, they did not expect to hear what Lauren had to say.
At some point, depending on some things here, you might have to make a real hard decision between your wife and your family and yourself and your life and your old friend, Wes Shermantine.
There's no hard decision there at all.
Okay, and...
I've already told you that. I mean, my family's more important than anything in the world to me.
Right. But I also sense in you, Lauren, that you're a good friend, and that unless we hold your fins to the fire, you're not going to give up Wes unless you're absolutely forced to.
Give him up what? I mean...
Well, I've already told you the what. The what that's bothering us is that we have a young woman who was seen talking with you guys, and we have a chunk of time that's unaccounted for. I mean, you're not unintelligent, Lauren. You can see, you know what the problem is.
Well, yeah, I can understand that, but like you said, you've got other people that said the same thing I said about after the bar.
Witnesses tell us that you, Cindy, and Wes are huddled up at the end of that bar.
I don't remember being in any huddle with anybody.
All right, but you guys are talking for not just a minute, not just a couple of minutes, but for an extended period of time.
I can't recall that.
So the second Lauren was brought into the interrogation room, he spilled everything. He turned against Wesley in a heartbeat and said right off the bat that Wesley was a cold-blooded killer and that he probably had killed over 24 people. And he went into detail. And I can't imagine what the investigators were thinking at this point, because they've been trying to pin Wesley for Chevy's disappearance for a very long time. They had seen the kind of behavior and the things he had been accused of. And I'm sure there was probably a moment where they weren't too surprised that this was being said. But I can also assume the amount of horror that they felt, because it probably was very true that there were that many victims based on his behavior. So first of all, Lauren went into detail about what happened with Cindy, because that was kind of like the first matter at hand. So Lauren's version was that they had all been together that night, that she showed up there to the bar, they were playing pool and drinking, and they'd had a few drinks, and before Cindy left, she mentioned to both Lauren and Wesley that she wanted some drugs. So Wesley and Lauren made a plan with her to meet her at the cemetery later that night. Lauren claimed that she got there like she was supposed to, everything was fine. But then he said that Wesley took them on, and I quote, a wild ride around the back road areas near the cemetery, and that things kind of went downhill from there. While they were in Wesley's car, he apparently asked or demanded sexual favors from Cindy. And when she denied without hesitation, he slit her throat. He killed her right then and there. And Lauren claimed that he played no part in the murder, that he remembered Cindy calling him for help, and that he was just so shocked that he kind of curled up in the back seat so he didn't have to see what was going on. And this wasn't the only disturbing information he had. So they did end up disposing of Cindy, but Lauren said he didn't know where. He said he helped put her in the trunk of the car, but then after that, he had no idea what Wesley did with her. But he offered up even more information as well. And just to give you an idea, this interrogation lasted 17 hours. This is how much information on these multiple murders I'm about to get into that Lauren seemed to have. He confirmed that Wesley had also killed Chevy in '85, just like authorities had already suspected, but I don't think he had too much information on this. And he also said that there was a third woman that authorities hadn't even connected to Wesley yet that he was definitely responsible for murdering. She was 24 years old, and her name was Robin Armtrout. Now, apparently, they both knew Robin, and they met up with her in September, I believe, of 1985. They decided they were going to go out and grab some drinks, but for some reason, they ended up going to like the middle of a field, like a pasture in the country of San Joaquin County. And just like before, apparently Wesley got carried away and ended up sexually assaulting her and stabbing her numerous times. I'm talking over and over again. I think it was over a dozen times. And then after that, he disposed of her body on Potter Creek. And I'm fairly certain she was found, and they just had never connected the dots. Lauren went on to say that the first murders that he was willing to speak about or knew of happened in '82. He said that Wesley killed two men, 35-year-old Howard King and 31-year-old Paul Kavanaugh. According to Lauren, they were driving around Roberts Island and they passed by a car that was just kind of sitting on the side of the road. So they decided to turn around, and Wesley apparently pulled up behind this car, grabbed a shotgun from the trunk. He immediately went to Howard King, who was sitting in the driver's seat of the car, and shot him. Then he went to Paul Kavanaugh on the passenger side, dragged him out, and then shot him and robbed both of the men of the most minuscule amount of money. And so it wasn't even for really a robbery, it was just, again, to do it. Authorities were able to check into this, and they realized that they were well aware of this case. There had been tire tracks that were actually taken as evidence. They did a cast of them, and they ended up matching the tires on Wesley's truck. So at this point, they're realizing, you know, he's got a lot of information and he could just be spouting off random things, but it's all kind of making sense now. Lauren also told authorities about a murder in '84. He said that he was in the car with Wesley driving down Highway 88, and they passed by yet another car parked on the side of the highway. And inside of the car was a man named Henry Howell. He was 41 years old, and he was apparently drunk and decided to pull over on the side of the road and sleep, and Wesley shot him. Again, I don't think he robbed him. He just shot him. Lauren also spoke of a murder in '94, and this time it actually wasn't even in California. They would hunt a lot and they would travel to hunt sometimes, which again makes this very frightening because there's no telling where these different victims could be at this point. But they went to Utah to hunt, and Wesley and Lauren crossed paths with another hunter. And without warning, Wesley just shot him, again, for absolutely no reason. And authorities also looked into this and were able to find evidence that a man was shot to death while hunting in Utah, but unfortunately, I have not seen that they found any evidence at all to connect to this person, and I've not even seen his name released. So far, Lauren had connected quite a few handfuls of murders to Wesley through his interrogation. And while Lauren is thinking he's handing over all of this information, and he genuinely believed he was going to be let go because he was kind of playing a victim. He is admitting to seeing all these murders, helping to dispose of bodies. He's saying he played no part, but he actually played a huge part. He never reported it, and authorities were not buying that he actually played no part. Authorities fully believed at this point that they both acted in this together, and Lauren was just pointing the finger.
You didn't tell me about the threatening part. Okay, what's all that about?
Just what Trevor tried to tell me.
Okay, you need to tell me then. What's the threatening part? What did he do?
What he told me.
I'm sorry.
What he told me.
Okay, what did he tell you?
He told me if I didn't help him and keep my mouth shut, he'd kill me.
Okay, and that was when? At what point did he tell you that?
On the way home.
On the way home? Okay. And would you tell him that?
I didn't say anything.
Okay. So he threatened to kill you if you said anything?
But if I didn't.
Or if you didn't help him? And as far as help, what did you help him with?
I actually didn't really help him with anything.
Did he ask you to help him with things?
Maybe help put her in the car.
You're rubbing up against that. I can't hear you.
Maybe help her put him in the car. Made me help him put her in the car.
Put her in the car? Approximately how many feet was Cindy and him away from the car when the stabbing took place?
Somewhere around 10, 15
10, 15 what?
feet.
Right. You said it's dark out there. If it's dark, how could you see him do the slashing motion?
Well,
Is there some light coming from somewhere?
there's silhouettes above the ground. Line of the ground.
Let me ask you this, all right? All I need is a yes or no. Were you present at some other criminal activity that West Sherman Time was involved in? Yes or no? We don't have to get any details.
Yes.
Yes?
Criminal activity?
Well, criminal activity,
Yes.
homicide. Were you present? All you have to say is yes or no. That's all I need to know. No details, yes or no.
Yes.
Is that a yes? All right. You can go have that cigarette.
He was trying very hard every time to play himself as this victim of Wesley's, which, maybe. I have no idea. I wasn't there. I don't know the guy, but I can see how Wesley could be very manipulative, so maybe it's a possibility, but the general consensus is that Lauren was just pointing the finger to save himself when he in reality played just as much of a part as Wesley did. Now, when Wesley was interviewed, on the other hand, he was entirely different. He was completely silent for the most part, wouldn't really give up a lot of information. He did confirm that he saw Cindy the night that she disappeared. He said they were at the bar together, they played pool, drank, had a good time. But he also said that Cindy left to go home way before he left with Lauren. And this was kind of one of the first times Wesley was caught in a lie. Because what he didn't know is that obviously Cindy's father owned the bar. It's very easy for them to get security footage immediately, and they captured both Lauren and Wesley leaving the bar immediately after Cindy and her friend left. They also confronted Wesley about Chevy, and he did the same thing Lauren did, where he turned around and he pointed a finger. Wesley told authorities that Lauren actually had a spare key to his family's cabin up in the mountains, and it was very possible that he was actually the one that took Chevy up there, so he was the one who should be the prime suspect in that disappearance. But again, authorities were quite a few steps ahead at this point. Authorities had Wesley's car. It had been repossessed, and so they were doing forensic examinations on it, and they found that there was blood on the headrest of his car as well as in the trunk, which corroborated the story that Lauren told them about Cindy. They eventually would go on and test this blood, and it did in fact match to Cindy. They also went to Wesley's cabin in the mountains, which was near the San Andreas area, and they found blood there as well, which also meant that that's likely where Chevy was killed.
You tell me, what are the possibilities of Cindy's blood being in your trunk?
I don't know that it is Cindy's blood.
We're telling you, it's 169 million to 1.
And I don't know how it got in there.
It's your car.
Yes, it is.
You have to make a decision in your own head to decide whether or not you really want to come forth with whatever happened if you're not responsible. If you're responsible, you know what, there's, you know what I'm saying?
If I had something to do with Cindy's disappearance, I would have been gone a long time ago.
Are you afraid of anybody out there, somebody threatening you?
No.
Both Lauren and Wesley knew at this point that they were kind of screwed. They had been caught, and Lauren had given everything up, so Wesley wanted to take a stab back at Lauren as best as he could, because these are two people that kind of trusted each other with these secrets for a very long time, and now they just so badly wanted to blame the other. So Wesley did speak to a reporter, and he said, and I quote, "If Lauren can give details about all these murders, it must mean that he's the one that did them. I'm innocent. With everything Lauren told detectives, I'd bet my life there were other bodies out there." And this has been a very interesting phrase to me. The few times that Wesley has kind of spoken and the things that he has said to people, he's very intentional about what he says. Like very, very intentional. And obviously, the first sentence, he was very focused on pinning it to Lauren. But I feel like in his sick, twisted mind, he still wanted to be celebrated for what he did. He wanted to, take responsibility because he was proud of what he did. So I think when he said, "I'd bet my life there are more bodies out there," he said that because he knew that, because he put them there, and that was his way of kind of bragging, because he had a tendency to brag, which I'll get into later. But it makes my hair stand up to hear some of the things that these serial killers and murderers say sometimes. So at this point, obviously, both men are arrested, and there were charges that were made, which I will get into in a minute, but authorities also wanted to continue searching for evidence because they did feel confident enough with the information that was given by Lauren that they would be able to connect. They already had DNA evidence linking Wesley to crimes. They had Lauren corroborating those crimes. So they felt they had enough, but they ended up going to Lauren's family's home because they really wanted to find murder weapons. And you guys, they found $40,000 worth of guns in his family's house. $40,000 worth. It took, I don't even know if they're done yet. It took a massive army, basically, of forensic specialists to look at all of these guns. They had to look to see if there was any evidence left behind. Is there blood on the gun? Are there fingerprints on the gun? Are they possibly from victims trying to, block the gun? And they weren't just looking into the cases they'd already been made aware of. Obviously, they had all of these men that had been shot while sitting in their cars that had been found. They wanted to see if any of those weapons were responsible for any of those murders, but they also were looking into other potential murders in the area because clearly these are serial killers. And according to their timeline, they were killing from like 82 to 85. And then there was a break until 94, I believe, and then in 98. There's no way, being serial killers, that in that time period, they just weren't killing people. So authorities knew the more likely answer was that it was just a bunch of unnamed victims that they were trying to search for. The first to go to trial was Wesley, and he went to trial in 2001 in Santa Clara, and he was formally charged with first-degree murder of Joanne Wheeler from 85. He was also charged first-degree murder in Cindy Vanderheiden's murder from 98, as well as Howard and Paul from 82. And those were the ones that were linked with the tire tracks, the two men that were killed in the same car. While the remains of both Paul and Howard had been found, at the point of the trial, the remains of Chevelle and Cindy had still not been found. But like I said, they felt they had enough to proceed. So more than 5 women came forward in this trial. It was quite a handful, but there were 5 that really stuck out to the jury and to authorities to speak about Wesley's violent, terrifying nature. A woman ended up being kidnapped by Wesley randomly. And the matter of this kidnapping, like how the circumstances played out, is terrifying to me because, again, it just showcases how he just did, like, it was all just victims of circumstance. And in my opinion, that's like the most terrifying scenario. He rear-ended a woman while driving, and they both pulled over, as you would typically do when you get in an accident, and she was going to attempt to get his insurance information. Wesley was like, you know what this is? This is a great opportunity for me to try to take someone to kill them. He actually grabbed this woman at knife point, okay, while she's trying to get this insurance information, and threw her in the car and took off with her. We all know what his plans likely were, but she managed to jump out of the moving vehicle to rescue herself. But just a random woman that he rear-ended, he saw it as an opportunity. His ex-wife also spoke about his brutal abuse. She spoke about what she had to endure, what their children had to endure. He didn't care if his children were present when he would abuse his wife, literally not in the slightest. It didn't bother him at all. There was also a babysitter of their children that took the stand and spoke about how she came one night to pick up money that was owed. And he again saw this as a prime opportunity to attack her, not caring at all who was in the house or who wasn't. And there was even another woman, and this one sends chills down my spine. It was an attempted sexual assault, and when he was trying to pin this woman down, he put her ear down on the ground, like down in the dirt, and said, and I quote, "Listen to the heartbeats of people I've buried here. Listen to the heartbeats of families I've buried here." He was proud of what he was doing, and he didn't care. And he would flaunt it in front of this woman that they were going to die and end up in the ground like the rest of his victims. He also said, "The heartbeats of families I've buried here." And that opens up so many possibilities. Also, during the trial, it was revealed that Wesley would frequently joke around with family and friends about making people in San Joaquin disappear. And at the time, they're just thinking he's making a joke. You know, people will say a lot, but he meant exactly what he was saying. But still, despite all of the mounting evidence and the really, really moving testimonies by a lot of very brave people that chose to stand in front of him in court and speak about what he did to them, he still consistently blamed Lauren for all of this, despite all these people that are like, he is so capable of every single thing that's being accused of him. He's like, oh, absolutely not. This was all Lauren. It was all Lauren's fault. He even decided to take advantage of the fact that both Cindy and Chevy's remains had not been found. He said in the middle of the trial that he would reveal the locations of 4 bodies if he was given $20,000. And obviously, authorities did not want to pay him $20,000 for where the remains were. He said, oh, but it's for my sons. I need to leave something to my kids. But they said absolutely not. So instead, they decided to offer taking the death penalty off the table if he handed over the locations of the remains, which Wesley did not want. He wanted no part of that deal. So you can imagine when he was found guilty, he was immediately sentenced to death. He is still to this day sitting in San Quentin death row. And obviously there was the moratorium. There wasn't a date that could be put down for him. And it's been over 20 years and he's still just sitting there. And one thing that really also got to me about his trial is that he actually had the nerve to look towards Chevy's parents during the trial when everyone was kind of speaking to each other and had their final word. And he looked at them in the eyes and said, my parents will know where I'm at when I'm gone, but you will never know where Chevy is. It was a devastating trial, and I have even more things that he said to victims' families later on. But it was difficult. It was difficult, but he was found guilty, and that gave a lot of people a ton of peace. Lauren was next on trial. He went to trial in 2001, and there's just not a lot out there about Lauren. And I think it's because he did play this, Wesley was, the mastermind. Wesley led all of this. But it still kind of irritates me that it seems like no one's really following his story and like the trial and the nitty gritty of him. Everyone just seems to be so fascinated with Wesley. But he ended up being charged with the murder of Cindy Vanderheiden, Howard King, Paul Kavanaugh. He also was charged in the murder of the female that he spoke about, Robin Armtrout. And he was also actually charged with being an accessory to murder in Henry Howell's murder. And if you remember from what I just said, Wesley wasn't charged with Robin Armtrout's murder or Henry Howell. So I found this very interesting that Wesley was charged in some capacity, and I dug forever to find out why that was the case because I was just kind of mind blown by it. And apparently, in the state of California, Wesley making those self-admissions that he was there and a part of the murders of Henry Howell and Robin Armtrout was enough for them to charge him with something related to the crime. However, they needed solid evidence because Wesley had not mentioned either of those names in order to charge him with murder. And apparently they just weren't able to find it at all. So they couldn't charge Wesley for those two, but they could charge Lauren. So that's what happened. Ultimately, Lauren was convicted of the murders of both Cindy and Paul Kavanaugh, but he was acquitted for the murder of Robin Armtrout, and he was found not guilty of being accessory to murder in the Henry Howell case. For some reason, I can't figure out if he ever was fully convicted for the murder of Howard. We know that he was convicted of the murder of Paul. I don't know if they just dropped it. For some reason, there's just a lack of information there. So regardless of that, those were his charges. Those were his convictions formally, and he was sentenced to 78 years in prison. But Lauren fought back. And in 2004, all of his convictions were thrown out. So apparently, when Lauren was arrested, first of all, he was questioned for 17 hours, which is a very long time. But when he was formally arrested, he spent 4 days waiting for an arraignment. Now, this can change place to place, but for the most part, you legally have to be arraigned. You have to be put in front of a judge after being arrested within 48 hours. There's some places that allow 72 hours because of weekends. Some places I've seen, it can get up to 5 days, but 48 hours seems to be, what typically the time frame is. So for him to sit for 4 days without being arraigned was a violation of his rights. And on top of that, during those 4 days, they kind of used them to bring in every law enforcement agency possible. So if there was a case where law enforcement believed that he could have information on it and it was connected, they were just letting these police in left and right from so many different investigating agencies to question him. Because of this, he ended up being denied food a lot of the time. He ended up being denied rest a lot of the time. And again, that goes against his rights. Now, I know a lot of people are gonna be like, yeah, but he killed these people. He's guilty. At this point in time, they didn't know that. You are innocent until proven guilty. And trust me, if you are ever charged with something that you are not guilty of, you're going to want those rights to be there for you. So whether the end result was innocent or guilty for him is irrelevant. He is required those rights from the get-go. And because he was not given those rights, they had to throw everything out. They basically ended up saying that it was coercion, that he was left to sit for too long, that the interrogation was 17 hours, and also during those hours, he was not, fed or allowed rest, so it led to coercion by authorities. But Lauren and his attorney did not want to risk another trial at all, which I understand them not wanting to risk another trial because I personally think he got off very easy with the charges that he had. And they decided because of this, they wanted to make some sort of plea deal, and it would basically only land him 14 years in prison with a possibility of parole. So Lauren, according to this plea deal, which was successful, he would have to plead guilty of manslaughter, so not first-degree murder, of Cindy, as well as plead guilty to being an accessory to murder in Howard and Paul's case, as well as Henry Howell's case, so all of them. Again, this was successful, so he was sentenced to only 14 years in prison. So by 2010, Lauren was released on parole. This man spent 9 years in prison, and that's it. For all of these murders, for 15 plus years of a crime spree. As you can imagine, this caused a pretty large uproar. The community was not happy. The victims' families were not happy. There were politicians that were repeatedly calling, sending letters. I mean, you had people rallying and, screaming and protesting. They did not want this man out of prison. But unfortunately, the prison system was like, look, we understand your fear. We get it. But technically, this is the time he was supposed to serve. He served it. There's nothing we can do. So to kind of ease the minds of the community, they decided the most they could do to help them was just put him somewhere that wasn't San Joaquin County. So instead, they transferred him to Lassen County. Lauren ended up being put in his own mobile home in the high desert state prison ground in Lassen County. But again, as you can imagine, Lassen County also was pissed. None of the community wanted this man to be living there. None of the local politicians, law enforcement, everyone was against it. So because of this, they decided to put even tighter restrictions on Lauren. So first thing is that he technically was living on prison grounds still. He was just kind of in his own home on prison grounds with rights to leave. He had to wear a GPS monitor 24/7, and if he went any further than 150 yards away from his home, it was alerted. When he did leave the grounds, he had to check in and check out, and anyone that was with him to check in or check out also had to sign in, show an ID, everything like that. And that was when he could leave, because there was only, certain time periods they allowed him to leave. Lauren was allowed out of his home to freely roam the public starting at 5:30 in the morning, and he had to be back by 1:30. He had to be at his home locked down from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. and then he was allowed to leave again at 3:30, but had to be in for the night by 8:30. And because of this kind of weird chopped up schedule, he also wasn't required to work, which again pissed people off, because this is a man that at the very least just willingly sat by in cahoots with a serial killer and played a part in murdering numerous people. He only spent 9 years in prison, and he basically was just put up with free room and board and was allowed 13 hours a day of free time, like unrestricted, unproductive free time in the community, and that terrified people. But this ended up only lasting for a year. In December of 2011, Wesley had gotten wind that Lauren had been released, and it's not been confirmed, obviously, but a lot of people believe Wesley was mad, that he was so angry that Lauren managed to get out. So he decided, again, like he had during his trial, to give up Lauren's burial sites. All 4 burial sites he'd claimed he would give up before, he said he would do it again in exchange for money, the same as the first time. This time, a man named Padilla decided he was going to take up this offer. He told Wesley he would give him $33,000 for multiple burial location sites, like maps to them. And Wesley agreed. Now, when this agreement was made, about a month later, I think things were hashed out. It was January 17th, 2012, when Padilla decided to call Lauren. And Padilla said, look, you're out right now. You've been out for a year, but I just wanted to let you know you should probably get a lawyer, because Wesley has taken an offer and he is going to give up all of your burial sites, and you're going to be going back to prison. After this phone call, later on that day, Lauren Herzog was found dead in his home. He had ended his own life because of what Wesley was about to do. Obviously, this was kind of a tricky situation because Lauren could potentially have more information he could have handed over to authorities, with more burial sites being brought forward. Also, obviously, there were a lot of families that wanted justice once these remains were found that Wesley was claiming to hand over. But there were a lot of people that felt a huge sense of relief now that he was no longer a danger to the community, and there was no way Wesley was getting out. He was on death row. And I thought it was very interesting because they released his autopsy report, and they spent a lot of time speaking about Lauren's tattoos, and that every single one of them showed how disturbed this man was. Every single one was satanic, like head to toe covered in satanic tattoos. He had a tattoo on his foot that, there's the typical saying like the devil made me do it, but the saying that he put down was, I made the devil do it. That's, kind of showing how evil he is, that he can tell the devil what to do. It was just very clear this man was evil. Lauren did not leave anything behind to authorities to help them kind of understand any more of the crimes. The only thing that he left was a very short and brief note that said, "Tell my family I love them." And within a month of his death, in February of 2012, Wesley did in fact release 5 separate hand-drawn maps to authorities. One was labeled the Boneyard, which was apparently a pretty large cattle field, I think near San Andreas. And there was another one that he referred to as Lauren's Play Area. He said all of the maps were just a bunch of locations where authorities could find either evidence or remains.
New here at 6:30, just 3 days after a notorious killer committed suicide. San Joaquin County authorities held a meeting today to talk about the possibility that there could be more victims in the so-called speed freak killings. Janet O tells us how the remaining living killer is now stepping forward with information about the victim's whereabouts.
Cindy Vanderheiden was killed November 1998. Her body has yet to be found. Instead of a headstone, a bench was made in her memory at the family burial plot. John Vanderheiden misses his daughter and wants closure more than anything else.
I always felt that eventually somebody come forward.
Vanderheiden learned on Wednesday his daughter's killer, Wesley Shermantine, was in fact going to lead officials to the remains of his victims, including Cindy's whereabouts. But for an unknown reason, the covert operation was canceled. The Stockton Record reported that the San Joaquin County Sheriff felt Shermantine could escape and that the operation was rushed. Vanderheiden doesn't buy it.
Those people are trained to do that, and it's kind of like, to me, it'd be like slapping me in the face if they said, and he puts in a statement, well, I'm afraid he might escape. I mean, that's saying, well, what's wrong with your men? Can't they handle it? And they do it all the time.
Today, San Joaquin County Sheriff Steve Moore, Calaveras County Sheriff, the FBI, San Joaquin County District Attorney, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation held a closed-door meeting to discuss moving forward with the search of homicide victims. Officials won't confirm much else except that they hope it happens in the near future.
I think it should have been done a long time ago.
One of these locations was a well, and this is where Michaela Garrett's case comes into play. There was a well that was exhumed at one of the locations. It was at one of the maps, or on one of the maps, and inside the well they found, I believe, like 1,000 bone fragments. And the bones were believed to possibly belong to Michaela Garrett. But the very first person they identified in these bones was missing 16-year-old Joanne Hobson, who disappeared in 1985. And this story makes me sick to my stomach. And I am just really disappointed in law enforcement and feel terribly for her family. She was the first one to be identified because her mom basically already knew that she was there. She had been classified as a runaway when she initially went missing, but when Lauren and Wesley were arrested, a detective approached her mom and said, "Look, I know we considered her a runaway, but we're pretty positive she was actually a victim of the speed freak killers." And when Joanne's mom heard this information, she ended up showing up to Wesley's sentencing. And there's a time at sentencings where families can speak to the convicted criminal and vice versa. And Joanne's mom attempted to speak to Wesley, but they wouldn't let her because her daughter, it was not one of his convictions. But it took a horrifying turn because when Wesley had his chance, he turned over, and we already know he said horrible things to Chevy's parents. But then he turned over and looked at Joanne's mom and knew exactly who she was. And he said, and I quote, "Joanne had a date that night that she disappeared, and I know who killed her." Authorities and Joanne's mom, I mean, just totally lost all the blood from their face because Joanne had in fact been heading off to a date that night, but nobody knew except the lead detective and Joanne's mom, indicating that Wesley and Lauren were probably one of the people that she was meant to go on a date with, which leads to what likely happened to her. After this information was given to Joanne's mom, she ended up going to prison 3 separate times to speak to Wesley. And she said that he was actually very honest and open with her, told her where she could find Joanne's body, and it was at this well. And she had been out there. Joanne's mom had gone to the authorities with the information that Wesley gave her, that her daughter was buried near this well, and for some reason authorities just didn't look into it. The same way San Joaquin authorities didn't want to look into the idea that Michaela Garrett could be there. It was kind of a big deal, and she said that when she went to this location, she just knew, she could just feel that her daughter was there. So when this map came out and authorities had their hands on it, it was the first time that they were like, all right, you know what? Maybe Joanne is there. So obviously that's someone they were looking for. But what's so disturbing is that Joanne's mom went to authorities and she was like, look, we all know you're going to find my daughter buried there. So please respectfully get her remains from the ground. I want you to leave her as intact as possible. Apparently, when they went in to excavate all of these remains in this well, they did it with a backhoe. And Joanne's mom showed up and quite literally showed up right when they were just digging up earth and bones were just falling from the backhoe. And this was the bones of her daughter after being killed by a serial killer and buried there. And it was being broadcasted on television. And she was seeing this right in front of her eyes. And she was just watching all the bones break from the pressure and force of this backhoe. And she was hysterical. She was so devastated. And in 2013, she ended up suing the sheriff's department and I think went on to sue the county because they had promised her that they would respectfully get her daughter's remains out of this area. When Joanne's remains were given to her mom, she felt like there was no way it was all her daughter because the backhoe did so much damage that's why all 1,000 pieces of bone were all fragmented because the backhoe just destroyed them. And she said that her daughter Joanne had already been a victim and they basically made her a victim of a horrific circumstance yet again when they did that. So she ended up pairing up with an FBI agent, a retired FBI agent, who said that this was horrible, that the police department did this to her and to Joanne. So they sent the remains off to be tested and found that 28 samples that had been given back to Joanne's mom were not Joanne. It was 3 other individuals, including a bone from a unborn fetus, which leads me to one of the next victims, which to this day remains unidentified. It was a woman, we know that much. I don't know of age, but it was her and her unborn baby. The last victim that was found there is 19-year-old Kimberly Ann Billy, and she disappeared in December of 1984, and that's pretty much all I know of her disappearance. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of information.
Yes, and we talked to some of the so-called speed freak killer victims' families, and they say that they hope the department will keep searching in other wells and keep digging.
Identified as Ms. Joanne Hobson.
San Joaquin County Sheriff Steve Moore identified the remains of 2 victims found in a well in Linden as Joanne Hobson and Kimberly Billy. Both young women were from East Stockton.
Efforts are continuing to identify the additional skeletal remains recovered from the Linden well of a possible 3rd person.
The department says there is a 3rd victim found in this well, not identified yet, and there may be more victims out there.
What I can tell you is that my investigative staff have been all over the area near the well that we did excavate, and there are wells up in that area. There are a number of other wells.
Convicted killer Wesley Shermantine says there are other bodies in other wells. Now, some families are criticizing the sheriff's department for taking too long to look.
What would you like to say to those families?
What I'd like to say to those families is that when we have credible information to work with, we are moving forward. We haven't asked the FBI to get involved. I believe that they are fully capable of making good determinations as to where to go for in the future based on the information that we provided them and any other information they can develop.
As for criticism the department received about using bulldozers to recover the remains,
we followed the protocols and the normal process that we have always followed, and we have been successful.
Now, Sheriff Moore says they will search in other wells, but he has not said when. We also want to let you know we talked to Joanne Hobson's family. They did not want to talk on camera today with this news. We are also hearing from other potential victims' families who say they have already turned in their DNA samples. They have contacted the department, so they're just waiting and hoping. Reporting live, I'm Melinda Meza, KCRA 3 Report.
Then they went to the boneyard, which again is near San Andreas. It's the cattle farm. And they ended up finally finding the remains of Cindy and Chevy buried in this location. And their parents said that this was actually a moment that they had been waiting for a very long time, and they finally felt peace. They said that it was a happy day. It wasn't a sad day for them, because it was one thing to see your child's killer be put behind bars permanently without any way to get out. But it was another thing entirely to realize that despite that, you still didn't have your child. They still didn't have a way to lay their children to rest. There was no closure. There was no sense of finally having them back to safety in whatever way they possibly could, which would be burying them and having somewhere to visit them. So finding these remains after all this time finally allowed these families to take a breath.
At 6 for you tonight, the parents of one of the victims killed by a pair of serial killers have flown thousands of miles to San Joaquin County to pick up their daughter's remains. KCRA 3's Melinda Meza sat down with Chevy Wheeler's mom and dad, who say it's time to bring their daughter home.
We never thought we'd get her back.
Paula Wheeler says she has been waiting more than 2 decades to bring her daughter home. 16-year-old Chevy Wheeler disappeared in 1985.
Said goodbye, Mom, I love you, the last time I saw her.
Her remains were found just 2 weeks ago in Calaveras County.
My husband and I just hugged each other, and it was a happy day.
Paula Wheeler says she was at Shermantine's trial beginning in 1999. She says he taunted her family.
Cindy and didn't kill Chevy. Chevy was my friend. I never asked for no reward on Chevy. She wasn't your friend. Yes, she was my friend.
My parents will know where I'm at when I'm gone, but she'll never know where Chevy is.
Paula, her husband, and their family flew 2,500 miles to be reunited.
I do know that a lot of what is referred to as the boneyard, the cattle area, had layers and layers of backfill. So I do know that excavating in that area went very slow. I don't know if they're still working on it. I don't know anything more about it. They haven't released anything. But I do know that an FBI agent has come forward since and stated that the renewed interest in these serial killers and potentially connected cases was such a good thing, but that police messed it up big time. This FBI agent called them out and said that they had badly hindered all of the investigation, all of the renewed interest, positive things that could have come out of it. They screwed up with, in his own words, lack of skill.
Allegations from a California lawmaker and victims' families. They claim the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department destroyed evidence related to the so-called speed freak killers.
He was murdered all over again by San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department.
Marie Gillette is angry. She says her father's missing person file was deleted. She believes her father, Phil Martin, is a victim of the so-called speed freak killers, Wes Shermantine and Lauren Herzog.
He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve it from the two that murdered him, and he didn't deserve it at all from law enforcement who was supposed to protect and serve.
Marie, her sister, and other family members of victims have filed court papers asking for answers.
I worked to get reward money.
Senator Kathleen Galgiani says a motion was filed today to ask a federal judge to lift a protective order in the Joan Shalley case against the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Department and the San Joaquin County Sheriff. Galgiani says she has proof the San Joaquin County Sheriff's Office removed missing persons information from the Department of Justice files, which would be a federal crime.
It's about getting to the bottom of why missing persons that are associated with the Shermantine and Herzog case, why they were deleted from the Attorney General website, which means that their DNA and their dental records and everything pertaining to their case was deleted. I turned over a letter to the Sheriff's Department from Wesley Shermantine to his sister saying where bodies were buried, and it was 3 days later that the deletions occurred.
But San Joaquin County Sheriff Steve Moore says it's not true.
The cases were not deleted, that they were transferred to the Department of Justice, as we stated, for management and oversight for a period.
When a killer makes a map and says, here's where the bodies are, that's like gold to law enforcement.
That's what I would believe.
Wesley Shermantine drew these maps from his prison cell, showing the locations of victims. He sent them to several people, including California State Senator Kathleen Galgiani. After the San Joaquin Sheriff's Department and FBI found 5 bodies, they stopped searching in 2013, citing Shermantine's refusal to talk to them and the reliability of his information.
He has not given me reason to not believe what he's saying. However, The Sheriff's Department has given me reason to distrust information coming forward.
CBS News obtained these emails showing that in 2010, someone from the San Joaquin Sheriff's Department ordered at least 5 cases involving victims of the speed freak killers canceled, requesting their removal from the national database of missing persons, even though their bodies had never been found. Jeff Reinick is a former FBI agent.
Is it rare for cases to be deleted off of this database?
I have never heard of any active missing persons case being deleted from a state or federal database.
You believe someone's trying to cover something up?
Yes. Law enforcement is supposed to serve and protect, not remove and destroy. Someone at the Sheriff's Department gave the order to destroy these records for these missing persons.
It's just scary. And considering how frequently these men seem to do this, I mean, they were killing people numerous times a year some of these years. And there's a whole gap that's just unaccounted for. And like I said, authorities said it's likely not from a lack of victims. It's just a big gray area. It's a time where there's a bunch of unnamed victims that we just haven't connected yet. And this is why it's so scary. And I believe that there's way more than 70 murders. And I think the number 74 precisely came out of Lauren's mouth. But it's scary. They killed for kind of what they wanted in the moment. Drugs, sex, unfortunately sometimes just for fun. And they would call it hunting. They also experienced with different MOs. So tracking this kind of killer and trying to connect cases is going to be just that much more difficult because sometimes they used guns. It was all different guns. Sometimes they used knives. Sometimes they shot or stabbed once. Sometimes it was over a dozen times. You know, they had bodies buried in wells and then other bodies buried just in the ground in a field. They had a ton of knowledge on coal mines, and a lot of people, including authorities, believe they could have disposed of bodies there, which will make them that much more difficult to locate. They also may be connected to someone that they burned in a burn barrel after dismembering. It was men. It was women. It was young. It was old. It was, you know, no set weapon, no set dump spot, no set time or place or circumstance. They played everything out by ear and just however they felt in the moment, which means that tracking, you know, a specific pattern like you would in a normal serial killer doesn't seem to be possible here. Authorities have said that they just played it out all so perfectly. They just always happened to be at the right place at the right time to catch someone that would never be found or they would never be connected to in an area that they never typically went. And you know, they disposed of these bodies somewhere that nobody would ever go to find them. Obviously, at this point, Lauren isn't here any longer to give any answers, and Wesley seems to only give them when he feels like it. He does hand things over. He does seem like he wants to talk about it. He spoke to Joanne's mom about it, told her exactly where she was buried, and he didn't lie about it. You know, he gave over these maps, but unfortunately, it seems like he will only do it if he gets something back out of it. I know that Padilla never paid him. He basically tricked him. There was never an intention of paying Wesley for the maps that he handed over. And because of this, he ended up actually going to a local news station, Wesley did, shortly after, and said that he wanted to give up more information and even indicated that there was a third person in their party that was killing with them. And that had never really been considered before. So he said he wouldn't give any information if Padilla didn't pay up, and Padilla didn't pay up, so there's kind of just this big guess now of, was there a third person? Is there another person out there that's still continuing to kill? Is there someone that's not been thrown in prison for the things that they've done? And then it's also kind of frustrating because it's like you don't want to have to pay this evil man for these answers, but you also want to because you want justice for these families. You want closure for these families. But then it's even more ridiculous because according to Wesley himself, he wanted the $33,000 from Padilla with the leftovers by his parents' headstones, but with majority of it, he really wanted to pay restitution so that he got privileges to buy candy bars. He was willing to give over the victims' names as long as he had $33,000 for quite literally candy bars. So it's just frustrating, and I doubt at this point he will likely give up much information. I'm hoping he does, but I feel like if he wanted to, he probably would have at this point. He is still alive again, so maybe there is a chance, but that also kind of is frustrating when it comes to the death penalty because there needs to be answers out of him. We only have less than 10 victims out of over 70 plus potential victims. Those are 70 plus families that need some answers. That is all that I have for you guys today. If you are one of those individuals that's constantly looking on NamUs and trying to connect cases like this is one that you can spend so long on. I'm going to go ahead and go, you guys. Thank you so much for, first of all, taking the time out of your day to listen to the stories of each and every one of these victims and hopefully doing everything you can to try to figure out if there are other victims that have gone unidentified. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button to become a part of the Howlin' fam so that hopefully we can bring them home together. And I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.